Let's talk about something most people deal with at some point, but never quite know how to handle. Someone in your life who just doesn't treat you right. Maybe it's a coworker who talks over you every time you open your mouth in a meeting. Maybe it's a friend who cancels on you last minute again and again without so much as a real apology. Or maybe it's someone who looks right through you when you speak, like what you're saying doesn't even register. It's a frustrating thing to deal with, and for most people, the response is one of two things. Either they say nothing and let it build up inside, or they blow up about it at the wrong moment and make the situation worse. Neither one really works. Here's where it gets interesting, though. A man named Niccolò Machiavelli spent the better part of his life studying exactly this kind of thing. Not disrespect specifically, but human behavior, power, and what actually determines how people treat each other. He lived in Renaissance-era Italy, worked as a political advisor, watched governments rise and fall, and spent years taking notes on what separated the people who commanded respect from the people who got walked over. He put a lot of those observations into a book called The Prince, and while people tend to think of that book as a guide for ruthless rulers, a lot of what's in there is just accurate. It's honest about how people actually operate, not how we wish they did. So today, we're going through 7 ways to handle people who don't respect you, drawn from Machiavelli's thinking. These aren't tricks, they're not manipulation tactics. They're practical, grounded approaches that hold up in real, everyday situations, at work, in relationships, with family, wherever. There are 7 of them, and the first one is something most people get wrong by doing too little of it too late. The first one is making your limits clear early. Machiavelli had a strong belief that most problems in politics, in leadership, in relationships don't start big, they start small, and they grow because nobody addressed them when they were still small. He wrote about how a ruler who ignores early warning signs or who avoids conflict to keep the peace almost always ends up with a much bigger conflict later. The same thing plays out in everyday life. Think about how this actually works. Someone disrespects you. Let's say they interrupt you in a meeting, they take credit for something you did, or they make a comment that crosses a line, and you don't say anything. Maybe you don't want to make it a whole thing. Maybe you tell yourself it's not a big deal, so you let it go. And what happens? It happens again. Because from where that person is standing, they tested a boundary, there was no pushback, and so the boundary doesn't really exist. They may not even be fully conscious of it. It's just how people work. They go as far as they're allowed to go. Machiavelli's answer to this was straightforward. Deal with things early before they become patterns. And here's the thing, it doesn't have to be a big confrontation. You don't have to sit someone down and have a whole conversation about it. Sometimes it's as simple as holding your ground in the moment. If someone interrupts you, you keep talking. You say, "Let me finish," and you finish your thought. If someone makes a dismissive comment about you in front of others, you respond calmly and directly. Not defensively, just clearly. The actual words matter less than the fact that you responded at all. What you're doing is establishing early that there's a person here who notices how they're being treated and who isn't just going to absorb it quietly. That changes the dynamic. Once that's established, you don't have to keep enforcing it over and over. The pattern is set. The longer you wait, by contrast, the harder it becomes. Because now there's history. The other person has been operating a certain way for weeks or months, and suddenly you're pushing back. It seems out of nowhere to them, which makes the whole thing more complicated than it needed to be. Machiavelli would say you paid more for the same outcome by waiting. Address it when it's cheap to address. The second way is to control what you show. Machiavelli paid a lot of attention to perception, how a leader was seen, what image they projected, and how that image shaped what people thought was possible when dealing with them. One of his core observations was that people respond to what they can see, and that someone who has no control over their own reactions is easy to read and easy to manipulate. In day-to-day life, this shows up in a pretty specific way. When someone disrespects you and you visibly react, when you get flustered, when you get emotional, when you make it obvious that what they said got to you, you've just handed them useful information. They now know exactly how to affect you. And for certain kinds of people, that's all they needed. Some people don't necessarily set out to be disrespectful, but once they figure out that a particular thing gets under your skin, they keep using it because it works.
So controlling what you show isn't about suppressing everything you feel or pretending nothing bothers you. It's about being deliberate. It's about not giving away your reactions in real time, especially to people who haven't earned that kind of access. The practical version of this looks like pausing before you respond. When someone says something dismissive or condescending or flat out disrespectful, instead of reacting immediately, you take a second. You stay steady. Maybe you respond calmly, maybe you don't respond at all. But either way, the message you're sending is that what they said didn't land the way they thought it would. Over time, people adjust to this. Someone who consistently can't get a rise out of you becomes less likely to try. It's not worth the effort. And the people who were doing it just to see how you'd react tend to lose interest fairly quickly. This is one of those things that sounds simple, but takes real practice. The instinct when someone pokes at you is to poke back. Machiavelli would say, resist that instinct. The person who controls the temperature of the room has more power than the person who just reacts to it.
The third way is to build alliances. This is one Machiavelli came back to again and again throughout his writing, and it's probably the one that gets most underestimated in everyday life. He was deeply convinced that a person's real strength, a leader's real strength, didn't come just from what they were capable of on their own. It came from who was in their corner. He watched rulers who were personally talented but politically isolated, and he watched them fail. Not because they weren't smart or skilled, but because they had nobody to back them up when things got difficult. And then he watched leaders who maybe weren't the most gifted individuals, but who had built genuine loyalty among the people around them, and those leaders lasted. The everyday version of this isn't complicated. It just means investing in the relationships around you. Not in a fake, strategic way. People can smell that, and it backfires. Just genuinely. Get to know your coworkers. Show up for your friends. Be the kind of person who's present and reliable. Because what that builds over time is a reputation, and that reputation matters enormously when someone tries to disrespect you. Here's what actually happens when you have strong relationships around you and someone treats you poorly. Other people notice, and if those people think well of you, if they've seen how you work, if they've experienced you as someone who's fair and decent, they're not going to just go along with whatever narrative the disrespectful person is trying to push. They'll push back. They'll vouch for you. They'll say, that's not how I've seen them operate. You don't even have to be in the room. A person with solid relationships is genuinely harder to dismiss than someone who's isolated, and Machiavelli understood that. He'd say that if you want to be treated with respect, make sure there are people around you who have seen firsthand that you deserve it. That's not manipulation. That's just not going through life alone. The fourth way is to stop chasing respect and start demonstrating it. This one is a little more subtle, but it might be the most important one on the list. Machiavelli noticed something consistent in the leaders he studied, the ones who were always seeking validation, always trying to prove themselves, always adjusting their behavior based on whether people approved of them. Those were the ones who got the least respect. And the ones who seemed to operate from a place of already knowing their own value, those were the ones people actually took seriously. What this looks like in real life is pretty telling. Think about someone you know who's always over-explaining their decisions, who hedges every opinion with, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but who apologizes for things that don't require an apology and jumps to justify themselves the moment they sense any pushback. Now compare that to someone who states their position clearly, doesn't fall apart when someone disagrees, and doesn't feel the need to convince everyone they're worth listening to. Those two people get treated very differently by the people around them, and it has very little to do with their actual credentials or accomplishments. The signal you send when you're constantly seeking approval is that your own sense of worth depends on whether others provide it. And people, consciously or not, pick up on that. They start to understand that you can be managed with approval or disapproval, that if they withhold respect, you'll work harder to get it, which means respect becomes a tool they can use on you rather than something you just have. Machiavelli's advice, translated into everyday terms, would be this: act like your value is already established. Not arrogant, not dismissive of others, just steady, not needing the validation. When someone challenges you, respond from a place of confidence rather than defensiveness.
When someone dismisses you, don't scramble to prove them wrong. Just keep going. Over time, the people around you calibrate to how you present yourself. If you present yourself as someone who expects to be taken seriously, most people will take you seriously. It's when you communicate through your behavior that you're not sure you deserve respect that things start to slip. The fifth way is knowing when to walk away. Machiavelli was nothing if not practical. He didn't believe in wasting resources on lost causes, and he was pretty clear-eyed about the fact that some situations and some people just aren't going to change no matter what you do. He believed the smart move was to recognize that reality and act accordingly, rather than keep pouring energy into something that was never going to return it. This applies directly to disrespectful relationships, because there's a version of everything we've talked about so far that works. You set limits early, you hold yourself together, you build the right relationships, you carry yourself with confidence, and the person adjusts. The dynamic shifts. That happens. But there's also a version where none of that moves the needle, because you're dealing with someone who either can't or genuinely won't treat you differently. And in that case, continuing to engage at the same level is just costing you. The practical version of walking away doesn't have to be dramatic. You don't need to have a big confrontation or send a final message or announce that you're done. Machiavelli would probably tell you that drawing a lot of attention to your exit is usually unnecessary and often counterproductive. You just quietly shift. You stop making yourself as available. You invest your time and energy elsewhere. You let the relationship or the dynamic find its own level, which without your effort propping it up will usually settle into something much smaller. What this requires is being honest with yourself about when you've actually tried. It's not about giving up after one conversation. It's about recognizing the difference between a situation that needs more time and communication and one where you've been clear, you've been consistent, and the other person has made their choice. Once you can see that clearly, the decision to pull back becomes a lot less emotionally loaded. It's not personal anymore. It's just resource management, which is exactly how Machiavelli would have framed it.
The sixth way is using silence as a tool. People tend to underestimate silence. When someone disrespects us, the reflex is to respond, to defend ourselves, to correct the record, to push back in the moment. And sometimes that's the right move. But Machiavelli had a lot of respect for the strategic use of saying nothing, and he had good reasons for it. When you respond immediately to every slight, every dismissive comment, every dig, every moment someone underestimates you, you're participating in a dynamic they've set up. You're playing by their rules, on their timeline. And often, even if your response is good, you've still given them something to react to, which keeps the whole thing going. Silence, by contrast, does something interesting. When someone takes a shot at you and you just don't take the bait, it creates a kind of discomfort for them. They expected a reaction, they were ready for a reaction, and when it doesn't come, there's nothing to grab onto. What you've communicated without saying a word is that what they did wasn't significant enough to warrant your energy. That's actually a harder message to argue with than anything you could say out loud. There's also something to be said for what silence does to the people watching. In a group setting especially, someone who can absorb a moment of disrespect without flinching, without scrambling to defend themselves, tends to come across as more composed and more sure of themselves than someone who reacts immediately. It signals a kind of security that's hard to fake. Machiavelli understood that the appearance of stability, of not being easily rattled, is itself a form of power. Obviously, silence isn't always the answer. There are times when you absolutely should respond, clearly and directly. But it's worth having this in your toolkit, because there are also plenty of moments where the most effective thing you can do is just not give someone the reaction they were looking for. And the seventh way, which is the one that ties everything else together, is being consistent. Of everything Machiavelli wrote about leadership and respect, consistency might be the thread that runs through all of it. He was actually skeptical of unpredictability as a long-term strategy. Some people think being unpredictable keeps others off balance in a useful way, and maybe for a moment it does. But over time, Machiavelli found that the leaders who lasted, the ones who maintained genuine respect and loyalty, were the ones people could count on to be who they said they were. In everyday terms, this is simpler than it sounds. It just means that your behavior matches your words over and over across different situations. If you've decided you're going to hold certain standards in how you're treated, you hold them consistently. Not just when it's easy, not just when you're in a good mood, but as a general rule. If you draw a line with someone and then let the same thing slide 2 weeks later, you've undone the line. And now they don't know where you actually stand, which means they have to test it again to find out. Consistency is also what builds the kind of long-term credibility that no single moment can create. One impressive conversation doesn't make someone respect you. One time holding your ground doesn't establish a pattern. But month after month of being someone who means what they say, who shows up the way they say they will, who doesn't perform differently based on who's watching, that accumulates into something real. People around you start to understand who you are. And that understanding is the foundation that everything else gets built on. Machiavelli would probably say it plainly. You can't manufacture respect. You can't talk people into it or demand it into existence. But you can, through sustained and consistent behavior, become someone who it would be genuinely hard not to respect. Not because you forced it, but because you gave people enough evidence over enough time that they really couldn't argue with it. And that's the through line in all 7 of these. None of them are about being aggressive. None of them require you to become someone you're not. What Machiavelli was really pointing at across all of his writing was self-awareness, understanding how you're coming across, what signals you're sending, and whether the way you're operating in the world is actually producing the outcomes you want. Most people who feel disrespected aren't dealing with some uniquely cruel person. They're dealing with a dynamic that developed slowly, often without much conscious thought from either side, and that could have gone differently at several points along the way. The good news about that is that dynamics can change. Not always, and not instantly, but they can. The 7 things we went through today: make your limits clear early, control what you show, build alliances, stop chasing respect and start demonstrating it, know when to walk away, use silence as a tool, and above all, be consistent. None of them are complicated. All of them take some practice, and any one of them, used regularly, can start to shift how the people around you see you and treat you. Machiavelli spent his life studying power, but what he kept coming back to was character. Who you actually are, how you actually carry yourself, and whether the 2 things match up. That's where respect comes from, and that's where it stays. If you've made it this far, you probably got something out of this. And if you did, there's more where that came from. This channel covers ideas like the ones we went through today, things that are actually useful, drawn from people who spent their lives figuring out how the world works. Machiavelli, Stoics, Sun Tzu, Robert Greene, thinkers who didn't sugarcoat things and who left behind a lot of practical wisdom that still holds up. We put out new videos regularly. If that sounds like something worth keeping up with, the subscribe button is right there. Takes about 2 seconds. No pressure either way, but if you're the kind of person who likes thinking about this stuff, you'll probably find the next video worth your time too. We'll see you there.